The world didn't see it coming. Africa, long seen as a raw materials supplier, is now rewriting the rules of global trade. Strategic partnerships, regional blocs, and domestic industries are challenging Europe, the US, and China. Jobs are growing, factories are booming, and Africa's voice is louder than ever. This isn't just trade, it's a revolution.
Africa no longer waits. The continent that had for centuries been defined by others, whose wealth was measured by the raw materials it exported, whose voice in global councils was muted, now stands not just as a participant in global trade, but as a shaper of its rules. The old system, forged by centuries of colonial extraction, Western-dominated institutions, and uneven economic influence, is cracking. New alliances are forming, agreements are being signed, and a historic economic shift is underway. The world is noticing, albeit belatedly, that Africa is no longer passive. For decades, Africa was seen primarily as a supplier of raw materials. Oil from Nigeria and Angola, cocoa from Ghana, and Ivory Coast copper from the Democratic Republic of Congo, coffee from Ethiopia, cotton from Burkina Faso. The continent produced a vast array of goods, yet the value chain beyond extraction largely remained overseas. Factories processed raw resources in Europe, North America, and increasingly Asia. African farmers, miners, and producers often received a fraction of the final profit, while the continent bore the brunt of market volatility. Political influence in international trade organizations, currency control, and commodity pricing favored established Western powers. Africa was a stage upon which others performed, not the author of its own story. But this era is ending. Analysts and historians are calling the current transformation historic because, for the first time in modern memory, African countries are negotiating collectively, leveraging scale, and forming strategic partnerships that place the continent in a commanding role. This shift is not spontaneous. It is the product of decades of political maturation, visionary leadership, and a growing determination to reclaim economic sovereignty. Colonial trade structures laid the foundation for dependency. Railways, ports, and roads were built primarily to transport resources from inland regions to coastal export points. Plantation systems, mining concessions, and forced labor created economies tailored for export rather than domestic development. Post-independence, many African countries inherited these extractive systems. Loans and aid from Western institutions often came with strings attached, reinforcing dependence. Global trade rules, through organizations like the WTO, IMF, and World Bank, remained skewed toward established powers, even when Africa technically had the same membership rights as other nations. The turning point came gradually but decisively. African governments began reimagining trade not as an obligation imposed by external actors, but as a tool for economic liberation. Regional trade initiatives gained traction. Leaders who had long advocated for Pan-African cooperation saw a new opportunity, combining resources, industrial capacity, and policy coordination to break the cycle of dependence. Independent from external dictates, they sought to build a network of trade agreements that leveraged Africa's immense human and natural capital. New trade blocs emerged, initially modest but increasingly influential. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, became a cornerstone, facilitating cross-border commerce, harmonizing regulations, and reducing tariffs among member states. Simultaneously, countries expanded strategic partnerships beyond the continent. Asia, particularly China and India, offered access to industrial technology and infrastructure financing. Middle Eastern nations provided investment in energy and logistics. South American countries, seeking new markets, engaged in bilateral trade agreements that emphasized fair value exchange. Unlike previous deals, these agreements prioritized mutual benefit, local industrial participation, and long-term development rather than immediate export of raw goods. Individual African countries played critical roles in this transformation. Nigeria, long recognized for its oil wealth, leveraged industrial zones and energy resources to attract new manufacturing investments. Its refining capacities expanded, allowing the country to produce higher-value petrochemicals locally rather than exporting crude oil. South Africa, with its robust financial system and manufacturing base, became a hub for continental investment and industrial strategy. East African nations, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, utilized their strategic ports and growing logistics networks to streamline exports, making the region a central corridor for trade both within Africa and to global markets. The Sahel region, often marginalized in past economic narratives, emerged as a geopolitical linchpin. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger invested in processing industries, agricultural cooperatives, and cross-border transport corridors, proving that the continent's economic resurgence was inclusive and geographically widespread. The shift did not go unnoticed by global powers. Europe, long accustomed to a position of advantage, began to see its influence erode. Traditional importers found African goods now reaching markets via alternative routes, with greater reliability and quality control. The United States, historically a dominant trading partner in Africa, faced stiff competition for contracts and commodities. China, while already a major investor in Africa, had to negotiate from a more balanced position, acknowledging African nations as partners rather than clients. The fear of losing economic dominance generated both competition and urgency among these powers. Trade negotiations became more complex, with African governments wielding leverage previously unimaginable. The effects inside Africa were profound. Local industries flourished as raw materials were increasingly processed domestically. Cocoa was no longer exported only as beans. It became chocolate, cosmetics, and food products for local and international markets. Minerals were refined and integrated into technology manufacturing chains. Cotton, once a raw export commodity, fueled textile industries across multiple countries. Jobs multiplied, and infrastructure development followed, from roads and ports to digital networks that connected farmers to buyers and manufacturers to global consumers. Technology transfer accelerated, with African engineers, scientists, and technicians receiving training and collaborating with foreign partners on equal footing. Politically, the continent's voice strengthened. African delegations began entering international negotiations not as petitioners, but as equals. The reduction in dependency on foreign loans and aid allowed governments greater freedom to pursue policies aligned with their citizens' interests. Pan-African unity, while never perfect, became more tangible, with shared initiatives in trade, energy, and technology, fostering a sense of collective agency. African nations began to insist on fair pricing, transparent contracts, and partnerships that prioritized mutual growth. Yet the shift was not without challenges. Internal political disagreements occasionally threatened cohesion, as countries with varying levels of development, governance styles, and economic priorities navigated shared strategies. Infrastructure bottlenecks, particularly in land transport, energy grids, and port capacities, occasionally slowed progress. Powerful foreign economies applied subtle pressure, attempting to maintain influence and challenge the rising African trade network. Negotiations were intense, but the overall trajectory remained upward. The continent's resolve, combined with pragmatic planning, allowed these hurdles to be addressed incrementally. Looking forward, predictions suggest that Africa could become a central hub for manufacturing and exports within the next decade. The combination of abundant natural resources, a young and increasingly skilled workforce, strategic geographic positioning, and coordinated policy frameworks positions the continent to take an unprecedented role in global supply chains. Countries could develop regional specialization, with North Africa focusing on energy and manufacturing, West Africa on agriculture and textiles, East Africa on logistics and technology, and Southern Africa on mining and finance. Such specialization, linked through intra-African trade corridors, could reduce dependency on distant markets and strengthen collective bargaining power globally. If Africa continues on this trajectory, the global balance of economic power may shift significantly. Traditional Western dominance will face substantial competition, particularly in sectors where Africa now commands both the resource and the capacity to process it. Emerging alliances with Asia, the Middle East, and South America could recalibrate trade relationships, investment flows, and geopolitical influence. Africa's collective agency in economic matters may translate into broader influence in environmental, political, and security discussions at global forums. In conclusion, Africa is no longer a passive player in global trade. The continent has moved from extraction to innovation, from dependency to strategic collaboration, and from silence to leadership. Through regional integration, smart partnerships, and domestic industrial growth, Africa is not merely participating in the global system, it is rewriting the rules. The shift is historic not only because of its scale, but because of the mindset it embodies, that Africa can define its destiny, negotiate as equals, and transform resources into power. The world is watching, but the story is no longer about Africa catching up. It is about Africa taking the lead. Stakeholders around the globe must take note, adapt, and recognize that the next chapter of international trade is being authored from the heart of the continent. Africa's rise is real, deliberate, and historic. Stay informed, because this is just the beginning.